Hello again, everyone. Hopefully you've seen the first video, which is on the death penalty and how the death penalty is applied in the United States. And this video is going to be about the affirmative case for abolishing the death penalty. Why would you run an affirmative that abolishes the death penalty? What are the advantages of running an affirmative that abolishes the death penalty, etc. So an overview of my lecture are going to be that I'm going to talk about plans for abolishing the death penalty. How could you get rid of it in the United States? Reasons for choosing a death penalty AFF. Is it strategic? Why is it strategic? Why would you consider running such an affirmative? And then the advantages for death penalty cases. So plans to abolish the death penalty. Probably the most common way you would strike down the death penalty is to use the Supreme Court. The Supremes, as my former civil procedure professor used to call them, have already banned the death penalty once before in Furman versus Georgia. It was reinstated in Gregg versus Georgia 4 years later. But the Supreme Court could declare that the death penalty violates the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution. And you can see the text of the death penalty here. Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. And the Supreme Court could say that the death penalty is a cruel and unusual punishment, it is unconstitutional, and they would strike it down. And that would apply to the federal death penalty and the states, which means there'd be no more death penalty in the United States. Another thing you can do, which some people advocate doing, is to use a constitutional amendment. You could specify in the constitutional amendment that the right to life is absolute, and therefore you strike down the death penalty on the grounds of the idea that everyone has a right to life, and the government doesn't have the ability to take away that right to life. And so a constitutional amendment, I admit, is a rare sort of affirmative case, but I think you could have some specific benefits. It would be a huge signal. It would be something that the court would have to apply. And so you could definitely run an affirmative that used a constitutional amendment. Now, you couldn't just use Congress. And the reason why you couldn't just use Congress is because the states have put their death penalty into place in their laws. So you could have Congress get rid of the federal death penalty, but the states would have to implement their own legislation or state Supreme Court decisions in order to ban the death penalty. Now, I've been around the debate block long enough to know that teams will use the maximum amount of fiat power that they're allowed. I can see negative teams counterplanning through both the Congress and the state courts to do their affirmative. I could see the negative team counterplanning to devolve authority of the death penalty to the states and then have the states get rid of the death penalty. I personally think that these are abuses of fiat and should not be allowed, but they've been done before, and so you need to be ready for the fact that people are going to play reindeer games with fiat. But in terms of the affirmative, the most basic case would use the Supreme Court, and another version could use a constitutional amendment to strike down the death penalty. So why would you want to run a death penalty affirmative? One of the biggest reasons is because the advantages are very large. Not only domestically, but internationally, you can claim advantages from the death penalty. So domestically, you could claim advantages like it's wrong to kill innocent people. You could claim a large racism advantage. You could claim a large right to life advantage, etc. But probably the real reason you want to run the death penalty is because you get access to a bunch of international advantages. So the trend in the world is against the death penalty. And the United States is an outlier in large portions of the world. You can look at the map. We're the only nation in North and South America that has the death penalty. Western Europe has banned the death penalty, and it's pretty much China, India, and a bunch of other random nations around the globe that have the death penalty. Therefore, it makes the US look bad when we're talking about human rights and we're trying to get other nations to not abuse human rights, when they're like, but you kill people. You think it's okay to kill people in your country, and yet you're telling us that what we do violates human rights? And it makes us look like a hypocrite on the world stage, and therefore we can't do a lot of things internationally that we would be able to do if we banned the death penalty. Another reason why you might want to run a death penalty case is because you can run a courts AFF. And I'm going to have an entire lecture on the courts and why you might run a courts AFF. But there are a lot of tricks to running courts AFFs, especially when it comes to the elections disad or the politics disad. The affirmative team can argue that those don't link to the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court will get blamed and politicians won't get blamed for the actions taken. And there are a lot of little tricks with regard to that the court can protect the president's political capital when it makes a decision and deflect blame. And so if you get good at those kinds of things, you can argue that there are strategic advantages as well as actual advantages you run in debate for running a death penalty affirmative. The other reason you might want to run a death penalty affirmative is you're generally on the right side. As we mentioned, a huge portion of the world has banned the death penalty. There's an increasing movement in the United States to ban the death penalty. And to be frank, on its merits, the death penalty is probably a bad thing. And so you have the bulk of statistical and empirical literature on your side on the question of running the death penalty. It's also good against critiques. Remember that you're saying it's wrong to kill someone. And so at a basic level, the critique, unless it has some chicanery that bans the death penalty for a different reason or a different framing or a different rhetoric to ban the death penalty, the critique has to accept the fact that the affirmative is claiming don't kill people. And that is a relatively hard burden for the critique to overcome, is the idea that it's acceptable under some circumstances to kill people. Most critique authors would not agree with that statement, and that's your starting point against the critique. So now I'm going to talk about various advantages you can run to a death penalty affirmative, and the first is innocence. So the basic idea is that not everyone put on death row is actually guilty of the crime. And there are a lot of reasons why someone might be not guilty of the crime. The first is that their lawyer could be bad. And so most people who get tried for the death penalty are not wealthy people. And so they are given a court-appointed defense attorney. The court gives them a defense attorney. Well, these defense attorneys are usually not very good. They don't get paid very much money. The private attorneys are usually much better. And there are some really egregious examples of what these attorneys have done or failed to do at trial. They've shown up drunk. They've failed to object to evidence that's damning against their client, even though the evidence was illegally obtained. They don't do their pleadings right. They don't do the paperwork right. And because of that, the person gets put on death row. In addition, if you can argue that the death penalty is administered unfairly, for example, that's racist, you could say a lot of people are on death row who didn't actually commit the crime because the jury, which juries are still predominantly white in the United States, decided that this person was to be put to death. An exhaustive study from the National Academy of Sciences says that 4 out of 100 people on death row are actually innocent. And so you get to claim that there is no reason whatsoever, there is no purpose served in killing an innocent person. You don't deter people because the person wasn't actually guilty of the crime. All you're doing is slaughtering someone who did nothing wrong. And so you start with the premise you would claim a deontological advantage, that it's intolerable to kill an innocent person, that we live in a free country and the one thing we for sure can't do is kill an innocent person. Even if you think it's okay to kill someone who is guilty of murder, you cannot tolerate killing an innocent person. And that an ends means analysis about the death penalty is flawed, and you should instead use an absolute moral rule that you should never kill an innocent person. The second advantage, as I foreshadowed before, is racism. And the death penalty is applied in a racist manner, both because of the defendant's race and the victim's race. So if you're black or if you're Latino, you're more likely to be put to death than you are if you're white. Another thing that's interesting is the victim's race matters even more than the defendant's race does. And so you are more likely to be put to death if you killed a white person than you are if you killed an African American, if you killed a Latino person, etc. A very famous study called the Baldus study in Georgia measured 1,066 random defendants and showed the death penalty was administered more based on the race of the victim. And this was a very thorough study. This had very good methodology. I'm not a social scientist myself, but they went through an exhaustive study and said this is true. While African Americans constitute 13% of the US population, they constitute 42% of the death row population. And there was an effort in a case called McCleskey versus Kemp to get the Supreme Court to strike down the death penalty on the grounds that it was applied unfairly due to race. And the Supreme Court rejected that analysis because they said you can't just prove that the death penalty is discriminatory overall. You have to prove that there's discriminatory intent in this individual case in order for the death penalty to be struck down. And it's very difficult to prove that an individual person had the intent to discriminate. But the Baldus study was used in McCleskey versus Kemp in an effort to get the death penalty struck down. Plus, juries are predominantly white, even in majority black areas. And that surprised me. But what you have in a lot of areas is you have an all-white jury with a white prosecutor, the court-appointed lawyers are white, and the defendant is black. Plus, attorneys have incentives to get rid of black judges. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, the majority of African American people don't like the death penalty because they think it's racist, because they think it could be used against them. So if you are a prosecuting attorney and you are given a jury, part of the standard of voir dire is that you can, under certain circumstances, do some things to select your jury. It's kind of like a strike in debate. You can strike certain judges off the card. And even though the Batson case says you can't strike someone exclusively because of race, they come up with a lot of excuses to get rid of black judges because they don't want someone on the jury who's not going to give the defendant the death penalty. So this is a strong advantage. I'd be a little cautious about claiming this in the 1AC because when we get to the negative, we're going to talk about the abolition critique. And I think that you don't want to be defending the entire criminal justice system on the grounds that it's not racist. And so you may want to hold back and use this more as an answer to the various race critiques on the topic. Advantage 3 is the right to life. It's innocence on steroids. It claims that the right to life is fundamental and should never be violated, even if the person committed a heinous crime. The government is in no way authorized to kill someone. You can claim a brutalization effect that says that When we kill as the government, it makes it more likely that people will kill in society, that it has a role modeling effect and causes more violence in society. You can claim this as a deontological advantage or international advantages related to upholding the right to life in various treaties and various customary international law norms internationally. Now we're going to turn to the international advantages of banning the death penalty, which when you're thinking about what affirmative am I going to run, how am I going to outweigh disadvantages like the elections disad, you can think to yourself, I need something international in scope. And you can start with international human rights. And the basic idea, and there's a famous article written by Mims, which is in your death penalty affirmative, which I would familiarize yourself with if you're running this affirmative, that other nations won't respect human rights if we don't. When we go around telling other nations, you can't torture people, you can't kill people, they'll be like, well, you kill people. You put people to death. You've killed this many people this year. Why can't we do those kinds of things? And it undermines the United States' credibility on human rights that we're one of the few nations in the world that still kills people. And that leads to human rights abuses in other countries. You can claim that both as a rights advantage and that nations that abuse human rights are more likely to go to war than nations that don't abuse human rights. It also destroys cooperation on international law. There's an increasing consensus that international law bans the death penalty, and the United States could jump on board of international law and lead the charge in international law by getting rid of the death penalty. And you can claim international cooperation advantages like terrorism and warming, and you can probably think of other advantages that come about from international cooperation. The next advantage is democratization. Banning the death penalty has been linked to democratization in other nations. The idea that having a democracy is dependent on the notion that you ban the death penalty, and the plan sends a very pro-democratic signal of getting rid of the death penalty. The plan sends the idea that it is intolerable in democracies to put someone to death, and other nations need to get rid of the death penalty as well. Then you can tap into the literature that democracies don't fight wars. So international relations scholars don't like to say there are fixed rules of international relations, that something is for sure true, but there are a group of scholars that say the closest thing to a rule in international relations is that democracies don't fight other democracies. And no matter what your definition of democracy is, it's very difficult to come up with examples as to when a democracy has fought another democracy. Some people say the path to peace in the world is to increase democratization around the globe, and there were people like the Bush administration that proactively tried to get democracies put around the globe to follow through with this thesis that democracies don't fight other democracies. The next advantage is soft power or moral leadership. The U.S. would gain a lot of moral leadership by banning the death penalty. Other nations think the death penalty is heinous. Other nations think the death penalty is really bad. If the United States took a stand and got rid of the death penalty, it would increase its soft power. Just as a brief definitional thing, hard power is military power. Soft power is the ability to persuade people. So you probably have friends that have a lot of soft power, that are very popular, that are very good at persuading people to do something. And if the United States does things that are moral, does things that are correct on the international stage, then they could gain moral leadership and gain influence with other nations. You can generally claim the benefits of U.S. hegemony or U.S. leadership. There's a wide array of international relations theorists that think the world is better when it is run by one power, and there's just a plethora of international relations articles which argue that the world is safer, more stable, cooperates better, less wars, less nuclear proliferation when the United States is in charge of the global order. You can also claim benefits of the liberal international order. So the first question you might ask is, what is the liberal international order? So after World War II, the nations of the world got together and said, hey, we had World War I, like a generation later we had World War II. What the heck? We need to do something to stop this from happening every generation. And so the Western powers got together and they created a lot of international institutions in order to try and prevent global war from happening again. The biggest one was the United Nations, a place where all of the nations of the world could get together, talk about their problems, etc. You also had the antecedents of the World Trade Organization in the Bretton Woods Agreement. And the World Trade Organization gets together with nations and they have a dispute resolution mechanism. And someone can say, hey, China's not trading fair, or the US isn't trading fair. And then the World Trade Organization makes a ruling on those nations. They also created the International Monetary Fund, which is a fund that can help bail out nations that are struggling with their economy. So especially during the 2008 recession, there were a lot of countries that were in danger of going broke, and the International Monetary Fund comes in and helps them out. The World Bank is another organization that comes in and helps people out. But the Western powers created this sort of safety net for solving world problems, and that's the liberal international order. And there are people that say the liberal international order is under strain right now, that nations are looking more towards themselves as opposed to international cooperation in order to solve problems. But if the US could bolster its moral leadership, nations would look to the Western model of the liberal international order as opposed to the Eastern model run by China and other authoritarian nations, which could be problematic for a lot of reasons. So in conclusion of this section, reasons for a death penalty AFF. Number one, you can run plans different than the US Congress and throw your opponents off guard. A lot of teams are not very familiar with debating courts AFFs, and they're not very familiar with debating constitutional amendment AFFs, so you can throw your opponents off guard by running a plan that does those kinds of things. Two, you can gain a lot of strategic advantages versus traditional policy arguments and critiques. I mentioned there are a lot of tricks if you run the Supreme Court to getting around elections arguments. You can imagine between now and November, elections is probably going to be the number one disadvantage that people run. The impacts to elections are huge. People will be excited about running elections. People who like to cut politics cards will research elections. And you can have some tricks as to why the Supreme Court wouldn't be linked to elections disadvantages. When the regular season begins after the elections in November, people will start running politics arguments, and you can have a lot of tricks against the traditional political capital and winners win style arguments. You also gain some defense against critiques by running the death penalty affirmative. Like I say, the critique has to say it's okay to kill people, which is quite a burden for the critique to overcome in the affirmative. And so you gain a lot of advantages like access to innocence advantages, access to race advantages, access to right to life advantages that give you some more legitimacy against the K. And third, you can claim large international advantages that outweigh their disadvantages. You can imagine, especially on this topic with the elections disad, that you're going to have to outweigh things like global warming. You're going to have to outweigh things like nuclear proliferation. And so you need a way to access the world stage. And a good way to access the world stage with your affirmative is to run the death penalty, because the United States is out of touch internationally with other nations on the death penalty. Other nations condemn the United States for using the death penalty. One way the U.S. could get back some of its credibility and leadership is to ban the death penalty, which is the reason why you might want to run it as your AFF.